Firefighter refuses to help Black family. What happens next makes him regret it. Derek Collins had always prided himself on being a dependable, no-nonsense firefighter. At 38, he was a veteran of the city's fire department, having worked for over 15 years in the same district, where his reputation for efficiency and quick decision-making was well established. It was a job that came with risks and unpredictability, but for Derek, those were manageable. He had mastered the rhythms of his workday, the routine that provided him with a sense of comfort and control. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. His shift usually began in the early morning hours, when the sun was still hidden behind the horizon and the world outside the firehouse was still. He'd arrive before most of his colleagues, stepping into the firehouse with a quiet determination. The station was always dimly lit at this time, the smell of coffee lingering in the air, mingling with the faint scent of diesel from the fire trucks parked in their bays. Derek would walk to his locker, take off his jacket, and begin to prepare for the day ahead. There was a specific order to his movements: checking the equipment, making sure the hoses were in place, inspecting the fire trucks. This routine was not just a job for Derek, it was his way of life. The familiarity of the firehouse gave Derek a sense of security, a comfort that many people might not understand. It was a place where he could shut off the noise of the world and focus solely on what needed to be done. He liked the predictability of it all, the shifts that never seemed to change, the crew he worked with, and the rhythm of responding to calls, even if they sometimes took longer than expected. At 38, Derek had reached a point in his career where he knew how to handle any situation that came his way. The chaos of fires, accidents, and rescues had become a well-rehearsed dance in his mind. He was a professional, and his ability to stay calm under pressure made him feel invincible. It wasn't that Derek was arrogant. He just believed in the merit of experience. He had seen it all: the burning buildings, the horrific accidents, the countless hours spent saving lives. But over time, the constant exposure to trauma began to numb him. He didn't react as emotionally as he had in the past. He had seen families lose everything, watched children cry for their parents, and pulled bodies from the wreckage of accidents. But all that had become routine, too. The burnouts, the lives lost, the moments of triumph, everything seemed to blur into a haze of predictability. He had learned to compartmentalize those emotions, focusing instead on the task at hand. In a way, it was a defense mechanism. It was easier to stay detached. Even within his personal life, Derek kept things simple. His apartment was sparse, furniture only as necessary, minimal decorations. He didn't entertain much, didn't have many close friends outside of the station. Most nights, he would eat a quick dinner, watch a bit of TV, and head to bed early, preparing for the next day's shift. There were no grand ambitions, no desire for change. He had a job he was good at, and that was enough for him. In his mind, his job was clear-cut: show up, put out fires, save people, and go home. It was an efficient system that worked, and it allowed him to avoid the complexities of emotional connections and personal growth. Over the years, Derek had earned a reputation for being a reliable, no-frills firefighter. People knew him as a man who got the job done, but they also knew he was a bit distant, almost robotic at times. He wasn't one to engage in long conversations or share personal stories. To his colleagues, he was a straight shooter, someone who did his job and kept to himself. Some of the newer recruits were intimidated by him, unsure of how to approach him. Others respected him for his unwavering professionalism. But no one really knew the man behind the uniform. Derek had cultivated this distance on purpose. In the world of firefighting, emotions could be a liability. And Derek wasn't interested in having emotions get in the way of doing his job. His personal philosophy was straightforward: keep the focus on the task. The fewer distractions, the better. He didn't think much about the people he was helping or the communities they came from. In his mind, they were just calls, just fires to put out, accidents to respond to, and lives to save. He didn't stop to consider the broader social dynamics or the deeper issues people faced. As long as the fire was out, the person was safe, and the job was done. That was all that mattered to Derek. However, there were moments when Derek couldn't ignore the reality of the neighborhoods he worked in. His station covered a diverse district, one that included affluent suburbs, middle-class neighborhoods, and areas with significant poverty. Over the years, Derek had seen the differences in how people reacted to emergencies, depending on their social status. In wealthier areas, people were often calm and collected, expecting the best treatment. They would offer coffee and thanks as firefighters worked, knowing they would be taken care of. But in poorer, underserved communities, especially in neighborhoods that were predominantly Black or Latino, the responses were different. There was often more fear, more anger, and more skepticism. Derek couldn't deny that he noticed the differences, but he never fully engaged with them. In his mind, a fire was a fire, and his job was to respond, not to interrogate the circumstances. But those subtle differences began to build in the background of Derek's mind. He began to notice that when people from certain neighborhoods called, there was often a sense of urgency, sometimes bordering on desperation. They'd frequently complain about delays, about the response time, about the lack of resources. And Derek, in turn, became less patient with these calls. He had grown tired of the constant demands, the interruptions to his routine, the feeling that people were pushing for something more than just help with their emergency. He didn't think much about the systemic issues that might be affecting these communities, issues like underfunded public services, crime rates, and the general mistrust of city institutions. To Derek, these were all just extras that complicated his job, distractions that kept him from focusing on what really mattered: the fire, the people, and the job done. His bias, though unintentional, had become a part of him. Derek wasn't an overtly prejudiced person, but over time, he had come to view certain calls as more troublesome or less important. It was a quiet thing, a shift in his thinking that had happened gradually. He would often prioritize calls in wealthier neighborhoods or those where the fire was more visible or immediate. Calls from poorer, predominantly Black neighborhoods, where the fires were less urgent or appeared smaller, often got pushed to the back of the list. Derek never considered how this might affect the people on the other end of the phone, or how it might feel to be dismissed by someone who was supposed to be there to help. As much as Derek liked to believe he was neutral, objective, and driven only by the demands of his job, the truth was that his comfort zone had begun to shape his responses in ways he didn't fully recognize. His job was predictable, and he liked it that way. But even in his seemingly controlled world, the seeds of something more were beginning to stir, something he wasn't prepared for, something that would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about his role as a firefighter and the city he served. The stage was set. Derek's comfort zone, his way of seeing the world, was about to be shattered in a way that would force him to confront not just the fires he fought, but the much larger, more complex issues that existed within the communities he served. And it would all begin with a single phone call, the kind of call he had learned to dismiss without a second thought. The Henderson family, at first glance, may have seemed unremarkable. They lived in a modest, two-story home in a working-class neighborhood of the city, nestled between rows of similar houses where people worked hard for what little they had. But beneath the surface, the Hendersons were far from ordinary. They were a family marked not just by their resilience in the face of everyday hardships, but also by their deep involvement in their community, a community that, over the years, had come to rely on their leadership and advocacy. James Henderson, the father of the family, was a man who had fought against the odds his entire life. A tall, broad-shouldered man with an easy smile and a deep, calming voice, James was known in the neighborhood as someone who could always be counted on. A high school teacher by day and a local community organizer by night, James had spent the better part of his adult life trying to bridge the gap between the city's marginalized neighborhoods and the institutions that were supposed to serve them. He had been a vocal advocate for better housing, safer streets, and more equitable public services. His work often brought him face to face with the city's leaders, where he pushed for policy changes that would benefit his community, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about racial disparities and socioeconomic inequalities. James had grown up in the very same neighborhood he now fought to improve, but his experiences there had not been easy. As a child, he had witnessed the slow decay of his community as businesses shuttered, schools fell into disrepair, and crime rates surged. He remembered the whispers of frustration that filled the streets as people gave up hope, resigned to the idea that their struggles were invisible to the powers that be. It wasn't just the poverty that wore on him, but the constant sense of being disregarded by those in charge. He remembered feeling invisible, like his voice and the voices of his neighbors didn't matter. It was a feeling he had never been able to shake. Denise Henderson, James's wife, was the quiet backbone of the family. Petite with a warm but firm presence, Denise was a nurse who worked long hours at the city's public hospital. She was no stranger to hardship, having grown up in a working-class family herself, but she had always believed in the power of hard work and dedication. Her job as a nurse had been a calling, not just a career. She had seen firsthand the toll that inequality took on people's health, particularly in underserved communities. Denise had witnessed the devastating effects of systemic neglect, the lack of proper medical care, the long waits in emergency rooms, the silent suffering that went unnoticed by those with the means to help. She had become an advocate in her own right, though her efforts were often more quiet and subtle than James's. She had founded health education programs for local youth, teaching them the importance of healthy living, nutrition, and self-care. She believed that by empowering the younger generation with knowledge, they could break the cycle of poor health and low opportunity that had plagued their families for decades. It was this quiet strength and determination that earned Denise the respect of everyone who crossed her path. She was a woman who made things happen, even if the results were small and incremental. Together, James and Denise formed a powerful team. They balanced each other perfectly, James with his public advocacy and Denise with her grassroots efforts. Their children, Isaac and Maya, were their pride and joy. Isaac, 16, was a high school junior with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. He had inherited his father's determination and his mother's compassion, and he dreamed of becoming a doctor to one day help people like his mother. Maya, 12, was a vibrant and curious middle schooler with a passion for writing and social media. She was already gaining a following online for her advocacy work, where she spoke out about issues like environmental justice and racial equality. Maya's online presence was becoming influential, and she often found herself speaking at local rallies or writing articles for youth-oriented publications about the challenges her community faced. The Henderson family was also closely connected to the local political scene. James had cultivated relationships with city council members over the years, most notably with Councilwoman Rita Foster, who represented their district. James had worked with her on several initiatives, including the expansion of affordable housing and the implementation of community policing programs that aim to reduce crime while building trust between the police and residents. Rita, though cautious in her political maneuvering, saw in James a rare ally, someone who spoke truth to power without fear of retribution. She had come to respect James's relentless pursuit of justice and his unwavering commitment to his community. He had become a trusted voice in the council chambers, and his opinion carried weight in local policy discussions. But it wasn't just their political ties that set the Hendersons apart. It was their sheer determination to improve the quality of life in their neighborhood, which was often overlooked by city officials. They had raised funds to improve local schools, organized events to clean up the streets, and even worked with local police to create youth mentorship programs. The Hendersons weren't just passively waiting for change to come. They were actively creating it. Their house, while modest, was filled with the buzz of constant activity. James would often host meetings with community members in their living room, discussing everything from crime prevention to job training programs. Denise would provide refreshments, quietly offering words of encouragement to anyone who is struggling or feeling defeated. Their children would often be present at these meetings, observing their parents' work and learning firsthand what it meant to give back to the community. But despite all their efforts, despite the connections they had cultivated and the respect they had earned, the Hendersons knew all too well that their neighborhood was still seen by many as a problem area. For all their hard work and advocacy, they were often dismissed by people who didn't understand the complexity of their lives. To outsiders, they were just another family in a struggling neighborhood, nothing more than a statistic to be ignored. And that reality often left James and Denise feeling frustrated and powerless. This frustration came to a head one afternoon when their home was threatened by fire. The kitchen stove, a second-hand model that had seen better days, was malfunctioned. A small fire started when the pilot light sparked, and before they could act, the flames quickly grew out of control. They did what they could to put out the fire, but it spread rapidly. Panic set in as smoke began to billow from the kitchen, and the family realized they needed help immediately. Denise grabbed the phone and called 911, speaking urgently to the dispatcher, explaining the severity of the situation. She emphasized that the fire wasn't contained and that they needed immediate assistance. The dispatcher, however, seemed unfazed, telling her that help would be on the way shortly. Denise, knowing how these things often went in their neighborhood, wasn't convinced. She knew all too well that when calls came from their part of town, they were often placed at the bottom of the priority list. So, she called again, but this time, she asked to speak with a supervisor, making it clear that this wasn't a small fire but an emergency that required immediate action. It was then that James, who had been watching the growing flames from the front porch, made a decision. He grabbed his phone and dialed Councilwoman Rita Foster's personal number. Rita was a friend, someone he trusted, and he knew that if anyone could push the situation to the forefront, it was her. He explained the urgency of the situation, his voice steady but laced with concern. Rita listened carefully, her own concerns growing as she heard the fire alarms in the background. "Don't worry, James," she said, her tone firm and reassuring. "I'll make sure someone gets there right away." James hung up the phone, a sense of relief washing over him. But as he looked back at his home, now filled with smoke and the threatening crackle of fire, he couldn't shake the feeling of frustration. This was the reality they lived in every day, fighting for their voices to be heard, fighting for their dignity to be respected. It wasn't just a fire they were dealing with, it was a symbol of the larger battle they fought every day, the battle for equality, for fairness, and for respect. The moment James made that call, it was clear that this wasn't just another emergency. It was something bigger. The Hendersons had powerful connections, but they were also deeply invested in their community's future. Their desire for respect, both as individuals and as a family, wasn't about pride. It was about survival. They weren't just asking for help with a fire. They were demanding to be treated as equals, demanding that their lives be valued just as much as anyone else's. As the fire grew, they could only wait, hoping that this time, the system would listen. The firehouse was abuzz, with the usual chatter of firefighters preparing for another shift. Derek Collins, as always, was the first to arrive. His station, located in the heart of the city, covered a large, diverse area, one that stretched from affluent neighborhoods to rougher, more neglected districts. As a veteran firefighter, Derek knew how to respond to any emergency with speed and precision. His training was flawless, and his reputation as one of the most competent members of the department had been cemented over the years. He had put out countless fires, saved many lives, and earned the respect of his colleagues. But today was different. Today, something would push him into a situation that would challenge his assumptions, his biases, and his entire approach to the job. At around 2 p.m., Derek and his crew were alerted to a fire in a residential neighborhood not far from the station, an area known for its mix of working-class families, many of whom were struggling to make ends meet. The dispatcher gave only the bare essentials over the radio, a report of a fire in a 2-story home, with no sign of smoke or flames from the outside, but a confirmed call from the residents inside. Derek listened intently, his mind already working through the logistics. A fire in a house like that wouldn't be unusual. Every day, the fire department responded to dozens of calls like this. But something about this one felt different. Derek didn't realize it at the time, but his thoughts were already clouded by unconscious biases. The neighborhood where the fire was reported was an area he'd been to countless times, a place he associated with delays, smaller fires, and what he often considered low-priority emergencies. In his mind, the residents were often seen as people who over-exaggerated situations or misjudged the urgency of their own needs. The more affluent areas, he thought, deserved the quick response times. Those were the calls that needed immediate attention. In the poorer districts, fires often started small and were contained before they caused too much damage. Derek had become used to dismissing these calls as less pressing, something that had grown like an unconscious reflex over time. As Derek and his crew piled into the fire truck, he couldn't shake the thought that this was just another routine response, another minor fire that would be extinguished. Head with little fanfare. He didn't anticipate the emotional weight that would soon bear down on him, nor could he foresee how the events of the afternoon would challenge everything he believed about his role as a firefighter and the community he served. When they arrived at the address, Derek was immediately struck by the sight of the house. The Hendersons' home was modest, yet well-kept, a two-story structure with dark red bricks and a small, tidy garden in the front. There were no signs of visible flames, no towering plumes of smoke like the typical house fire Derek had grown used to. The situation didn't look urgent. In fact, there was a momentary sense of calm that set off an alarm in his head. Why had this fire caused so much panic from the residents? Why had they been so desperate on the phone? He was met by James Henderson, who stood outside his front door, his face grim but controlled. The moment James saw Derek, he didn't waste any time with pleasantries. His voice, though calm, carried a sense of urgency. "The fire's inside. It started in the kitchen, and it spread fast," he said, motioning toward the doorway. Derek nodded, his professional instincts kicking in. But a part of him still couldn't reconcile the lack of visible danger with the gravity of the situation. His mind was still operating on the assumption that this would be like any other small fire, contained, manageable, and easily dealt with. But James's body language told a different story. As they moved inside, Derek was immediately hit by the heavy, acrid smell of smoke. The heat in the air intensified the moment they crossed the threshold, and he could hear the distant crackling of flames, the telltale signs of a fire that was much larger than it had seemed from the outside. The kitchen was a mess, the countertop covered in soot, and the flames were licking at the edges of the cabinets, threatening to engulf the rest of the house. Derek and his team sprang into action, unrolling the hoses and starting to douse the flames. But as he worked, Derek noticed something strange, a tense atmosphere that hung in the air. The Hendersons had been quick to call for help, yet there was something almost off-putting about the urgency in their voices. Derek couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the house. James was still at his side, watching closely as Derek led the effort. "Thank you," James said, his voice low but filled with genuine gratitude. "We didn't know what else to do. The fire was spreading faster than we could handle." Derek gave a curt nod, focused on the job at hand. But as he continued to work, he started to notice small details that he hadn't expected. Denise Henderson, who had been standing by, her arms wrapped tightly around Isaac and Maya, seemed a bit withdrawn, her eyes darting between Derek and the flames. Maya, ever the observer, was looking at Derek intently, her gaze unblinking, as though sizing him up. The tension in the room was palpable, but Derek couldn't quite place its source. As the fire was finally under control and the smoke began to dissipate, Derek took a step back, surveying the damage. The kitchen was completely destroyed, charred walls, ruined cabinets, and remnants of what had once been a functional space. But it was clear that the fire had been put out before it could spread to the rest of the house. Still, the damage was extensive, and the family's home would need repairs. For a moment, Derek stood in the silence that followed the chaos of the firefight, letting the weight of the situation settle in. He was used to moving quickly from one emergency to the next, but something about this moment seemed different. There was an unspoken discomfort between him and the Hendersons that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't hostility, but there was a guardedness in the way they interacted with him and his crew. As if, despite the fact that he had just helped save their home, they didn't entirely trust him or the department he worked for. It was a feeling Derek wasn't accustomed to. In his mind, firefighters were supposed to be seen as heroes, saviors in times of need. But here, in this house, the warmth of gratitude he often received seemed absent. Instead, there was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. Was it suspicion? Resentment? Derek wasn't sure, but the way the Hendersons looked at him made him feel like an outsider in a place he thought he knew well. "Are you guys going to be okay?" Derek asked, trying to break the silence, his voice tentative. James gave him a look, one that seemed to weigh the question carefully before he answered. "We'll manage," he said, his tone steady. But it's more than just the fire, Derek. You're not the first ones to show up, and you won't be the last. But sometimes it feels like we're just forgotten. Like no one takes us seriously. The word stung, though Derek didn't show it. He knew the city had its problems, but hearing it spoken so plainly hit him differently. His job wasn't just about putting out fires, it was about serving people. And in this moment, Derek realized he hadn't fully understood what that meant. As the team packed up and prepared to leave, James lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Derek's. There was no anger in them, only a quiet plea for understanding. Derek stood there, unsure of what to say. He had just done his job, saved a family's home. But for the first time in his career, he realized that sometimes doing your job wasn't enough. Sometimes, the real work was learning to see people, not just the fire, not just the crisis, but the human beings behind the call for help. After the fire was contained and the house was no longer in immediate danger, Derek Collins couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The entire situation, the fire, the tension in the Henderson family's home, the unsaid words in James's and Denise's eyes, felt like an enigma he couldn't quite solve. At first, Derek had dismissed his own discomfort. He had always prided himself on being the professional firefighter who stayed level-headed in emergencies, someone who didn't get bogged down by feelings or emotions. He was there to do his job, save lives, extinguish flames, and leave. That's what he'd always done, and it had worked well for him for over a decade. But today, something gnawed at him, and he couldn't ignore it. As he stood outside the Hendersons' house, supervising his crew as they began to clean up, Derek's thoughts raced. He kept replaying the scene inside the house, the way James had thanked him, but had also hinted at something more profound. The unease in the air, the almost palpable sense of distrust. James had spoken plainly about how their community often felt forgotten, how they had learned not to rely on the fire department or the city for real help. The more Derek thought about it, the more it troubled him. He had been to this neighborhood countless times before, responding to calls in the same area, and had never once stopped to consider the deeper issues that were at play. As he climbed back into the fire truck to head back to the station, Derek's mind kept turning over James's words. "Sometimes it feels like we're just forgotten," James had said. That line stuck with him, replaying in his mind over and over again. He had always assumed that people who lived in poorer neighborhoods were just more likely to overreact, to make a mountain out of a molehill. Fires in these neighborhoods were often small, easily contained, not life-threatening. But now, standing in that home, seeing the desperation in James and Denise's eyes, Derek began to realize that his previous assumptions about this community, about its people, were based on his own biases, not reality. In the days that followed, Derek found it harder to shake the thoughts that had emerged during the fire. He went through his shifts as usual, responding to fires, working with his crew, and moving on to the next call without giving much thought to the Hendersons or their neighborhood. But something in him had changed. His once unshakable confidence in the way he performed his job now felt hollow. He could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that there was something he had missed, something crucial that he hadn't seen before. He had spent his career focused only on putting out fires, but what if the real challenge was something else entirely? The more Derek reflected, the more he began to realize how little he knew about the lives of the people in the neighborhoods he served. He had always kept his distance, kept his focus on the job, never venturing into the personal or political issues that shaped people's lives. But now, that approach felt inadequate. The fire at the Hendersons' home had brought something to light that Derek couldn't dismiss any longer: the systemic inequalities, the deep-seated frustration, and the alienation that existed in these communities, which had been overlooked by the institutions that were supposed to serve them, institutions like the fire department. It wasn't just about the fire anymore. It was about the trust that had been broken, the failure to see people not just as addresses on a map, but as individuals with real needs, real struggles. Derek's role as a firefighter, he realized, was more than just to put out flames. It was to serve the people, to listen, to understand, and, in some cases, to acknowledge the underlying issues that made each emergency unique. He had spent years reacting to crises, but he had never truly questioned why certain communities experienced crises more frequently than others. It wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of years of neglect, underinvestment, and systemic injustice. Determined to better understand the situation, Derek decided to reach out. He made an appointment with his fire department's community liaison officer, a woman named Carla Reyes who had worked with neighborhood organizations in the past. Carla had always been a bit of a thorn in Derek's side. She was younger, more idealistic, and had a different approach to firefighting than he did. While Derek was focused on the technicalities of the job, Carla was focused on the community, on building relationships and trust with the people they served. Derek had always thought her approach was too soft, too focused on feelings, and not enough on the job at hand. But after the events with the Henderson family, he felt it was time to listen. Carla was more than willing to meet with him. When they sat down in her office at the station, Derek was surprised by how straightforward and honest she was. She didn't mince words. "Derek, the truth is, the fire department has a bad reputation in certain parts of the city," she said bluntly. "We show up, we put out fires, and then we leave. We don't engage with the communities we serve. And that leaves people feeling like they don't matter. Like they're invisible. I know you're not one of the bad guys, but you have to understand how it feels from their side." Derek was taken aback by her directness. For years, he had convinced himself that his job was simple, that the fire department was simply there to do its job, and that any problems with the community were someone else's issue. But as Carla spoke, Derek began to see the truth in her words. She explained how many neighborhoods, particularly those that were predominantly Black or Latino, had been historically underserved and often ignored by the city's services. There were systemic issues that went beyond just the fire department, issues of poverty, lack of access to resources, and historical mistrust of authority figures. "They're not just calling because of a fire," Carla continued. "They're calling because they're afraid. They're afraid their house will burn down and no one will come. They're afraid their lives don't matter to the city." Derek listened, and for the first time, he allowed himself to hear what Carla was saying. He realized that his perspective had been incredibly narrow. He had been so focused on his role as a firefighter, on the fire itself, that he hadn't taken the time to understand the larger picture. What Carla was describing wasn't just about putting out fires, it was about addressing the underlying fears, the lack of resources, and the systemic failures that led people to feel like they had no one to turn to. The more Derek thought about the Hendersons, the more he realized they were a reflection of a larger issue, one that affected entire communities in this city. Their frustration, their sense of abandonment, wasn't just about a single fire. It was about years of feeling invisible, of fighting to be heard, only to be overlooked by the very systems that were supposed to help them. He understood in that moment that the fire department was a part of that system. And if he was going to make a difference, he had to be willing to see people as more than just emergencies, more than just statistics. Over the next few days, Derek began to reach out to the Henderson family. He didn't want to just fix the immediate damage from the fire. He wanted to know more about their lives, their struggles, and how he could help. It was an awkward start at first. He wasn't sure what to say, how to bridge the gap between the professional firefighter he had always been and the human being he was beginning to understand he needed to become. But James and Denise were receptive. They were willing to talk, to share their experiences. James invited Derek to a community meeting, a local gathering where people could voice their concerns and talk about issues they were facing in the neighborhood. Derek attended the meeting, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the issues the Hendersons and others in the community were facing. It wasn't just about fire safety, it was about economic instability, poor housing, a lack of resources, and a deep sense of distrust towards the institutions that were meant to protect and serve. The meeting was uncomfortable, filled with tension, but it was also eye-opening. Derek found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing the stories of the people around him, trying to understand the roots of their anger and frustration. As he walked out of the meeting that night, Derek realized that he couldn't return to business as usual. The work he had been doing, showing up, putting out fires, and moving on was no longer enough. He had seen the human side of the equation, and it was impossible to unsee. His role as a firefighter wasn't just about fighting fires, it was about fighting for the dignity and safety of the people in his city. And he knew that from now on, he had to be more than just a responder. He had to be a listener, a supporter, and most importantly, an advocate. The weeks after Derek's meeting with Carla Reyes and his first real encounter with the Henderson family were an odd mixture of progress and uncertainty. Derek felt like he was finally on the right path. He had shifted his mindset, realized the depth of the issues affecting the community, and started to build relationships with people like James and Denise Henderson. There was a renewed sense of purpose in his work that hadn't been there before. For the first time in years, he believed that being a firefighter was more than just responding to fires. It was about engaging with the community, learning to listen, and doing his part to help address the systemic issues he had ignored for so long. He was on the verge of achieving what he thought was his true goal, to be more than just a firefighter, but a force for positive change in the city. Derek took his newfound insights and tried to integrate them into his day-to-day work. He began reaching out to other families in the neighborhood, especially those in areas that had suffered from neglect, those that were often left to fend for themselves. He started visiting people after their fires were extinguished, sitting down with them, listening to their stories, and offering support. Sometimes it was practical advice, sometimes it was just a listening ear. Derek knew he couldn't solve all their problems, but he had begun to believe that simply being there, showing he cared, was a step in the right direction. The Henderson family, especially James, became a point of reference for Derek. He would check in with them regularly, asking how they were doing and offering help where he could. They were appreciative, but still distant. James was always polite, but there was a wariness that never seemed to fade. Denise, too, seemed grateful, but Derek felt that there was a hesitation in her eyes, something she wasn't ready to share with him yet. He understood, though, change couldn't happen overnight, and he would have to prove that his actions were more than just a passing gesture. He was patient, determined, and committed to making amends, to showing the Hendersons that he wasn't just another firefighter who would disappear once the smoke cleared. One afternoon, after another fire in the area had been put out, Derek received an unexpected call from James. It was brief but urgent. "Derek, we need your help," James said. "Can you come by? It's about something serious." Derek's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what was going on, but the gravity in James's voice told him that this wasn't a small issue. He knew this could be his chance to truly prove himself, to show that his efforts to understand the community, to engage beyond the role of firefighter, were starting to pay off. When Derek arrived at the Hendersons' house, James was waiting for him outside. The atmosphere was tense. "What's going on?" Derek asked, trying to read James's expression. James hesitated for a moment, then motioned for Derek to follow him inside. The house, though still in disarray from the fire that had nearly destroyed the kitchen, felt eerily silent. Denise was sitting at the kitchen table, a look of distress on her face. Maya and Isaac were nowhere to be seen. Derek assumed they were in their rooms, away from the adult conversation. "We've been talking," James began, his voice low. "We've been talking about what's been happening in the neighborhood, about the fire department, and about the way we've been treated by people in positions of power." Derek stood still, unsure of what was coming next. "I've been trying to help," he said, his voice measured, though inside, he was nervous. "I've been reaching out, doing what I can. Is there something more I can do?" James looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The thing is, Derek," James said, "it's not just the fires. It's everything. It's the lack of response from the city. It's the way they ignore us, the way we're treated like our lives don't matter. You think you're the only one who's been trying to do something about it? You think you're the first one to come in here and say, 'I'm here to help.' People have been trying to make change in this neighborhood for years, but every time we get close to something real, something happens to stop us." Derek felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been trying to do the right thing, to make amends, to prove he wasn't just a part of the system that had failed the Hendersons and others in the neighborhood. But James's words hit him like a ton of bricks. He realized, for the first time, that what he thought was genuine progress, his attempts to engage with the community, his actions of reaching out to the Hendersons, were seen as superficial at best, and at worst as another empty gesture in a long history of broken promises. "What do you mean?" Derek asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought I was helping. I thought." "You don't get it, Derek," James interrupted, his voice rising in frustration. "It's not about just showing up after the fire's out. It's about what happens before, during, and after. People don't trust the system, and they don't trust you either. They see you as part of that system. You think just helping one family makes everything better? That's not how it works. The words hit Derek hard, but there was truth in them. He had been blind to the bigger picture. He had believed that if he showed the Hendersons he cared, if he reached out with good intentions, that things would start to change. But he hadn't accounted for the deep, ingrained mistrust that came from years, decades, even, of systemic neglect. He hadn't realized that just one firefighter, no matter how well-meaning, couldn't undo a lifetime of historical injustice. James's frustration deepened as he continued. It's about power, Derek. The people in this neighborhood, they're not just fighting fires. They're fighting to be seen. They're fighting to be heard. And that's something you can't fix with a couple of visits and a few phone calls. We've been ignored for too long to just accept a Band-Aid fix. Denise spoke up from the kitchen table, her voice quieter but still firm. James is right. We appreciate you, Derek, but you have to understand something. You've been trying to help us as if we're just another fire call. But this isn't about fires. It's about the way we live, the way we survive, the way we've been left behind. You can't help by just showing up after the damage is done. You have to fight with us, fight to change things from the top down. Derek felt a profound sense of failure. Everything he had done, the outreach, the check-ins, the attempts to build a relationship, suddenly felt meaningless. What James and Denise were saying was that he hadn't truly been part of the change. He had been a part of the problem, merely performing the duties expected of him without truly engaging with the root causes of the issues. And now, the realization that his actions were perceived as mere tokenism stung more than he had expected. James's voice softened slightly. I'm not saying you're a bad guy, Derek. But you can't just fix everything with a couple of good deeds. The problem runs deeper than that, and you have to get your hands dirty. You've got to understand what's at stake. You can't just show up and feel good about yourself. Not anymore. It was the weight of these words that finally broke through Derek's defenses. He had believed that helping the Hendersons was his way of making things right, his path to redemption. But he hadn't even begun to understand the true scope of the problem. The system they were all working within, him as a firefighter, them as a family living in a neighborhood that had been ignored for too long, was broken. And no amount of good intentions or personal efforts could change that. Derek had been acting like a savior when, in fact, he was just another cog in the same wheel of neglect and inequality. As he left the Hendersons' home that evening, Derek's head was spinning. He had spent so much time believing he was making a difference, that he had been helping people in need. But in reality, his actions had only been a temporary fix, an illusion of change. And as James had pointed out, the problem went much deeper than that. He hadn't solved anything. He hadn't even come close. That night, Derek found himself questioning everything. He thought about his career, the way he had always approached his work, the role he played in the larger structure of city services. He thought about the city itself, the systems of power, the historical injustices, and the people who had been left behind. For the first time, Derek realized that he wasn't just a firefighter. He was part of a much larger system that needed to change. And the cost of his false victory, the belief that he could help with mere gestures, was now clear. He had a long way to go before he could truly be a part of the solution. The days following his conversation with James and Denise were some of the most difficult of Derek's life. He could not escape the feeling that his entire world had shifted, that everything he had believed in for so long, everything he thought he knew about his job and his role in the community, was now in question. Derek had always prided himself on his integrity, on doing his job with pride, but now that pride felt hollow. The words James had spoken echoed in his mind, and the weight of their meaning grew heavier with each passing hour. The idea that his attempts to help had been nothing more than superficial gestures stung far more than he had anticipated. For days, Derek tried to go through the motions of his job. He responded to fires, conducted his usual duties, and engaged with his crew as he always had. But there was a deep disconnection inside him. His thoughts were constantly with the Hendersons and with the other families in the community who had been neglected for so long. He realized now that no amount of goodwill, no amount of personal effort could ever make up for the systemic failures that had plagued these communities for generations. He had been blind to the bigger picture, and the realization that he had been complicit in a system that failed people like James and Denise, as well as countless others, began to weigh on him in ways he didn't know how to process. The first sign of how this new understanding would affect him came during a routine meeting at the firehouse. The department had been discussing the budget for the upcoming year, and Derek's crew was tasked with suggesting improvements in their district. When it was his turn to speak, Derek couldn't help but voice some of the frustrations he had been carrying. He had always kept his opinions to himself, but now, standing before his colleagues, he felt like he had to speak the truth. "We need to do more than just respond to fires," Derek said, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to engage with these communities. People don't just need us when there's a fire. They need us to be present, to support them before disaster strikes. They need us to stop treating them like emergencies, like cases, like numbers." The room went silent. His colleagues, most of whom had been in the department for years, exchanged uncomfortable glances. They were used to Derek's stoic demeanor, his no-nonsense attitude when it came to their work. But this new version of Derek, the one who was challenging the system he had once accepted, was unsettling to them. One of his senior officers, Lieutenant Morgan, cleared his throat. "That's all well and good, Derek," Lieutenant Morgan said, his tone dismissive. "But that's not our job. Our job is to put out fires. That's what we're trained for. The rest is up to the city or the community organizations, not us." Derek clenched his fists, but he didn't back down. "No, it's not just about the fires. It's about the people. These communities have been ignored for too long. It's not enough to just show up when things go wrong. We need to be involved before it gets to that point. We're supposed to be public servants, but we're failing them." Lieutenant Morgan's gaze hardened. "I don't know where this is coming from, but you need to stick to the job. It's easy to talk about saving the world, but this isn't about saving everyone. It's about doing our job and moving on. If you can't handle that, maybe you need to rethink things." Derek stood in stunned silence. The conversation was over. His colleagues had clearly decided that this wasn't the direction they wanted to go. The system they had worked within for so long was one that they accepted without question, and Derek's sudden shift in perspective had created a rift. He was no longer in alignment with their worldview. He was the outlier, the one who had dared to ask uncomfortable questions, and for that, he had become the target of their skepticism and disdain. As he left the meeting, Derek felt a deep sense of isolation. He had always thought of his crew as a second family, a group of men and women he could rely on. But now, for the first time, he realized how deeply ingrained their attitudes were, how unwilling they were to question the status quo. It wasn't just about his own department. It was about a larger culture, a system that had long been set in its ways and that rejected anything that threatened its stability. Derek had challenged that system, and now he was beginning to see the price of that challenge. The fallout from that meeting didn't stop there. Word of Derek's comments began to spread throughout the department, and the whispers started. Colleagues who had once respected him now looked at him with distrust. They called him an idealist, a bleeding heart, someone who didn't understand the reality of their job. Derek couldn't escape the judgment. It wasn't just his fellow firefighters who were questioning him, it was also the higher-ups in the department. Derek had become a threat to the order of things, and that was something the powers that be couldn't tolerate. A few days later, Derek received a call into the chief's office. Chief Anderson was a no-nonsense leader, a man who had worked his way up through the ranks and had little patience for anyone who rocked the boat. Derek knew immediately that his career was on the line. "Derek," Chief Anderson began, "I've been hearing some unsettling things from your colleagues. I understand you've been speaking out about how we do our job, about the role we play in the community. I have to tell you, this is not the kind of attitude we expect from someone at your level. This department has a long-standing tradition of focusing on the task at hand. We put out fires. We don't get involved in politics. We don't get involved in social causes." Derek felt his stomach tighten. He knew where this was going. He had crossed a line, and now the consequences were becoming clear. "I'm not trying to be political," Derek said, trying to steady his voice. I'm just trying to do what's right. People are suffering in these neighborhoods. We can't just ignore it anymore. We have a responsibility to do more than just show up when the flames are already out of control. We need to be proactive." Chief Anderson leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. This department doesn't have the resources to be proactive. We're stretched thin as it is. And frankly, this kind of talk is undermining the work we do. If you can't accept that, maybe it's time for you to reconsider your position here. Derek's heart sank. He had known, on some level, that his stance would alienate him, but hearing it from the chief himself made it all too real. His desire to change things, to be a part of something larger than himself, had now become the very thing that threatened to destroy his career. He had believed that his good intentions would be enough, that people would rally around him, but the reality was far harsher. In this system, change was not welcomed. It was seen as a disruption. That night, Derek went home, feeling a deep sense of loss. He had worked his whole life to become a firefighter, to be a respected member of the department. But now, it felt like everything was slipping away. He had paid a heavy price for his desire to do more, to engage, to truly help. The system that had defined his entire career was pushing back against him, and there seemed to be no way to reconcile the two worlds he had been trying to bridge. The next few days were filled with tension. Derek's colleagues continued to distance themselves from him, some outright refusing to speak with him, others barely acknowledging his presence. He knew his position in the department was tenuous at best. But as much as the rejection hurt, it was the realization that his efforts had been futile that stung the most. He had wanted to make a difference, to be the firefighter who saw beyond the flames and understood the people he was meant to serve. But now he was faced with the harsh truth that the system he was part of had no place for someone like him. He was an outsider, someone who didn't fit into the narrow box of what a firefighter was supposed to be. Derek sat alone in his apartment one evening, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He had set out with the best of intentions to be more than just a firefighter, to be a real force for change. But now, after everything that had transpired, he was left questioning whether it was even possible to make a meaningful difference from within the system. Had he been naive to believe that one man could change an entire department, an entire city? Or was the system simply too entrenched, too powerful to be disrupted by the likes of him? As he sat there in the silence, Derek realized that the price of his false victory had not just been his career. It had been his entire understanding of who he was and what he had hoped to accomplish. The truth was, he had wanted to be the hero, the savior, but now he saw that the real battle was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Derek's return to the firehouse after the fallout from his confrontation with Chief Anderson and his estrangement from his colleagues was almost surreal. The firehouse, which had once been a place of camaraderie and routine, now felt foreign to him. The laughter, the banter, the easygoing nature of his fellow firefighters, all of it seemed distant, like a memory of a life he could no longer access. But at the same time, it was the same old firehouse, with its old smells, its peeling walls, its clunky equipment, and its familiar rhythms. In many ways, it felt like nothing had changed at all. But Derek had changed. He had no choice but to accept it. In the months since his awakening, since his attempt to be something more than a firefighter, Derek had come to terms with the uncomfortable truth. The system he had been part of, both the fire department and the larger structures of power, was not designed to effect real change. It was a machine built on routines, protocols, and traditions that were set in stone. The ideals he had hoped to inject into it had only served to alienate him further from his peers and the very institution he had once trusted. It was early one morning when Derek stood in front of his locker, tying his boots with a methodical precision. The hum of the building seemed louder than usual, almost suffocating. The firehouse was bustling with its typical morning activity, firefighters moving around, prepping gear, talking about the latest sports scores or the best places to eat in town. Derek's heart felt heavy, the weight of his isolation pressing down on him. It had been weeks since the chief's meeting, and the tensions in the department hadn't dissipated. Derek was still viewed with skepticism, even by the younger recruits who had once looked up to him. The camaraderie he had once taken for granted was gone. In its place, there was a quiet, palpable distance. He had returned to his old role, but it didn't fit him anymore. He went through the motions, responding to calls, putting out fires, and performing his duties with precision, but there was no longer a sense of purpose. The satisfaction he used to get from the job, the feeling of doing something meaningful, had evaporated. What remained was an overwhelming sense of disillusionment. It wasn't that Derek didn't still care about his work. It was that he now saw it for what it truly was, a small cog in a vast machine. Fires could be put out, but the deeper issues of inequality, neglect, and systemic injustice would always linger. During a particularly quiet shift, as Derek leaned against the firehouse counter, scrolling through his phone, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Carla Reyes, the city councilwoman who had been one of the few people to take an interest in Derek's shift in perspective. She had reached out to him several times since their meeting, offering advice and support, encouraging him to continue pushing for change despite the resistance he faced. "Derek," Carla said, standing in the doorway with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How's everything going?" Derek looked up from his phone, forcing a smile. Same old, same old. You know how it is." Carla raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension in his response. "I can tell it's more than that. You look different, like you've been through a lot." Derek sighed and set his phone down. "I have. It's just not what I thought it would be. I wanted to make a difference, Carla. I thought if I just got involved, if I started listening to people, if I reached out and tried to make a real connection, that I could help change things. But it's not that simple, is it?" Carla leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "No, it's not. Change takes time, and it takes more than one person. The system you're working within, it's not just going to let you fix it with good intentions. It's not just about helping one family or showing up after fire. It's about the bigger picture, the structures in place that keep people in poverty, that deny them access to the resources they need to thrive. It's about the power that's being held by people who don't have to live with the consequences of their decisions." Derek nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I get that now. I tried to be a hero, but what I didn't understand was that I was fighting the wrong battle. I was trying to fix the symptoms, not the disease. The Hendersons, James, Denise, they made me see that. But I couldn't change anything. I couldn't even change myself. Not in any real way." Carla stepped forward, her voice softening. "You don't have to change everything overnight. You're not supposed to fix everything by yourself. What you can do is keep pushing, keep speaking out, keep making noise. Even if it feels like you're not making any progress, even if it feels like you're fighting against a brick wall. That's what real change looks like, small victories that add up over time." Derek was quiet for a long moment. He had thought that change would be swift, that if he just did the right thing, the world would bend to his will. But now, he understood the true nature of change. It was a slow and painful process, filled with setbacks and resistance. And it wasn't a process that could be undertaken alone. He wasn't meant to be a hero, and he wasn't supposed to do this by himself. It was going to take a collective effort, one that would require patience, persistence, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Derek's thoughts were interrupted when his pager went off. There was a fire on the north side of the city, in one of the most underserved neighborhoods. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, giving them the details of the call. Derek stood up quickly, grabbing his gear and heading for the truck. As he did, Carla followed him out, her footsteps quick and purposeful. "I'm not going anywhere, Derek," she said as she fell in step beside him. "I know things are tough right now, but this is where the real work starts. There's a lot we can do together." For the first time in a long while, Derek didn't feel entirely alone. Carla had offered him a lifeline, a sense that there were people out there who shared his vision for real change, people who understood that the fight wasn't just about putting out fires or responding to emergencies. It was about addressing the deep inequities in the system that created these emergencies in the first place. The drive to the scene was quick, but as they approached the neighborhood, Derek felt a familiar sense of urgency build inside him. He had seen this kind of situation many times before, people caught in cycles of poverty, living in crumbling buildings, and having to rely on the fire department to respond to the aftermath of a disaster. This was the kind of neighborhood where people like the Hendersons lived, where systems of neglect were perpetuated by those in power, and where people were left to fend for themselves. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. Smoke billowed from windows of an old apartment building, and several residents were gathered outside, looking anxious and uncertain. Derek and his crew sprang into action, pulling hoses and preparing for the rescue operations. As he moved toward the building, Derek found himself thinking about everything that had led him to this moment. His desire to help, his desire to make a difference hadn't gone away. It had simply evolved. He wasn't going to save the world with one act of heroism, and he wasn't going to fix the systemic problems that plagued these communities with a few well-meaning gestures. But what he could do, in that moment, was be there. He could do his job with the knowledge that it wasn't enough to just respond to the fire. He could keep pushing for change in ways that were sustainable, in ways that involved the community, in ways that confronted the larger issues head-on. And for the first time, Derek felt like he was truly doing his job, not just as a firefighter, but as a part of something bigger. As he fought the fire and helped the residents evacuate, he found a new sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be long, and that he would face resistance every step of the way. But he also knew that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. When the fire was finally under control and the last of the residents had been evacuated, Derek stood on the sidewalk, catching his breath. Carla was there beside him, her face reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "You're still in this, huh?" she said, offering him a small, knowing smile. Derek nodded. "Yeah, I'm still in it. I think I'm starting to understand what it really takes." Carla clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. That's all any of us can do. One step at a time." And for the first time in a long while, Derek felt like he was on the right path, not just for himself, but for everyone who needed him.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.